The end didn't announce itself loudly. It arrived as a silence so complete that every instinct in me went alert at once. I remember thinking something irreversible just happened, even before I knew what had been said. The charity gala in Scottsdale was supposed to be routine. Warm lighting, donor smiles, the low hum of money congratulating itself. I stood near the bar, bourbon in hand, watching the room the way I always did, measuring tone, movement, risk. Megan was working the crowd effortlessly, the way she always had. Confident, polished, untouchable. Then I saw her standing too close to Tyler. Her hand rested on his shoulder, not briefly, not accidentally. It stayed there. She laughed, real laughter, and turned slightly so the people around them could hear her. When she spoke, the words landed harder than anything shouted. "I could leave him right now," she said, smiling, just for the thrill. The room reacted before I did. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. Everyone waited, not for her, but for me. They wanted a reaction, a correction, a scene. I walked over slowly. No rush, no anger. I took a sip, let the quiet stretch until it couldn't be mistaken. Then I met her eyes and said, evenly, "If that's what you want, now's the time." No accusation, no threat, just an open door, offered in public. Her hand slid off his shoulder. That was the moment normal life ended, not because of what she said, but because she'd said it like it wouldn't cost her anything. Before that night in Scottsdale, our life looked clean from the outside. Not perfect, but stable in the way grown adults aim for when they're building something real. I'm Ethan Brooks. I bought my first busted-up commercial building at 28, right after I'd spent a decade learning what water, time, and neglect do to brick and steel. I wasn't trying to be a big developer. I was restoring old properties in small towns, bank buildings turned into offices, abandoned grocery shelves turned into mixed use, a motel that became workforce housing. Early mornings, long drives, meetings in dusty rooms, and a constant parade of inspectors who wanted to feel important. Megan fit into that world better than I ever did. She came from people who knew how to dress for a room. Her dad sold medical equipment and somehow turned it into a lifestyle. Megan didn't flinch around money. She understood donors, board members, committee chairs, the kind of folks who sign checks with a smile and still want to feel like they're the hero of the story. When we got married, I figured her social skill was just another tool, like my tape measure, her calendar. We were different, but it made sense. Our division of labor settled without a fight. I handled properties, contractors, schedules, permits, negotiations where silence mattered. Megan handled events, branding, the look and feel of our projects, the way our name traveled in conversation. She could take a renovation I was proud of and turn it into a narrative people wanted to fund. She knew how to make restoring a tired downtown block sound like saving a community. For a while, it worked so well I stopped checking it. We had routines. She'd take meetings over lunch at places with white tablecloths. I'd eat in the truck, phone propped on the dash, answering calls while I watched crews set steel. I'd come home tired and dusty, and she'd be dressed like she'd stepped out of an ad. She'd ask how the site went, I'd ask how the event planning was going. We'd trade notes, share a glass of wine, go over budgets. The numbers always looked fine. The schedule always looked full. And then the small signals started. At first, they were easy to dismiss because they didn't come with evidence, just a feeling I didn't want to admit I had. Megan started making jokes about me in public. Not cruel ones, not at first. Little digs. How I lived in work boots, how I'd rather talk to a foreman than a donor, how she had to translate me. People laughed. I smiled because that's what you do. I told myself she was smoothing edges for us, making us relatable. Then she started comparing. Not directly, not in a way that would start a fight. Just comments. How some guy was so organized, how another couple traveled constantly, how someone's husband actually enjoyed these things. The phrases were light, tossed off like harmless observations, but they stacked up in my head the way small cracks do in concrete. Names began to repeat in her stories. Tyler said, Tyler thinks, Tyler knows a guy, Tyler this, Tyler that, like he was part of our operations. When I met him, he seemed like one more bright suit in Megan's world. He had the right handshake and the right laugh. I didn't feel threatened by him. I felt annoyed by him, which is different. Threat feels sharp. Annoyance feels manageable. Megan's phone started living face down. Always. even in our kitchen, even when she went to shower. She'd glance at the screen, thumb a reply, then lock it like she was closing a drawer. If I walked behind her, she'd shift the angle. She'd say she was handling something, or just confirming details. I didn't push because I didn't want to become the kind of man who interrogated his wife over a notification. Late messages became normal, then late calls, then quick meetings that ran long. And I kept telling myself it was a phase, stress, momentum, networking, the cost of building a bigger life. I told myself the work demanded it. I told myself Megan was just excited. I told myself I was tired and reading too much into it. That's what I believed, right up until a Scottsdale ballroom went quiet around my marriage. After the Scottsdale night, I didn't confront Megan. I didn't even bring it up on the drive home. That's what surprised me most about myself. I'd always assumed if something cracked in our marriage, it would be loud, an argument, a slammed door, some dramatic line you can't take back. Instead, it was quiet. The kind of quiet you get on a job site when everyone realizes a beam isn't level and nobody wants to be the first one to say it. Megan acted like nothing happened. The next morning she was already talking about follow-ups, thank you emails, who we needed to keep warm for next year. She moved through the house like the charity night was just another successful event. Her voice was bright. Her energy was forward-facing. If I tried to talk about it, she would have treated it like I was trying to drag us backward. So I didn't. I just started watching. Not in a paranoid way. Not the way insecure men watch their wives, looking for proof to match a fear. It felt more like running a project when you realize the numbers don't reconcile. You don't accuse the bookkeeper. You pull statements. You check the dates. You look for the error, because the error exists whether you admit it or not. The first thing I noticed was how many coincidences needed Megan's phone. Her screen was always face down, like it was a rule. If it lit up, she'd touch it fast and dim it before the name showed. If she stepped away to take a call, it was never in the open parts of the house. It was always the laundry room, the pantry, the back patio where the sliding door muffled her voice. When I walked toward her, she'd end the call with a laugh that didn't fit whatever she claimed they were discussing. Her stories started arriving pre-shaped, too polished, like she'd rehearsed them. I ran into Tyler today, she'd say, casual, like his name wasn't a spark. He had this idea about the next property launch. Or, Tyler's connecting us with a photographer. Then, later, the details would shift. Times change. Locations change. Who said what change? Not by much, just enough that if you remembered the first version, the second one didn't sit right. I stopped correcting her. I stopped trying to pin it down in conversation. I let her talk. I let her edit herself. And names. Names repeated like a bad chorus. Tyler came up in everything. Branding, donors, vendor lists, social strategy. It was like she'd woven him into our life so deeply that pulling him out would unravel the whole story. Sometimes she'd say his name and watch my face, waiting for a reaction. I gave her none. I nodded once, like he was a subcontractor she'd hired. Like I didn't care. But I did care. I just didn't show it. I started keeping a mental log without meaning to. Dates, times, the small gaps. She'd say she was going to a planning lunch, and come home with no folder, no notes, no flyer drafts, nothing she usually carried when she'd actually worked. Her perfume would be fresh, like she'd reapplied it midday. She'd take a shower earlier than normal. Her mood would be elevated, then oddly flat when she saw me, like she had to switch roles. The lies didn't announce themselves as lies. They showed up as friction, small inconsistencies that created heat when they rubbed against reality. And once I noticed friction, I noticed patterns. The same phrases. Last minute. Had to handle it. You know how it is. She used those lines like keys, unlocking the door to my usual patience. Before Scottsdale, I would have nodded and moved on. After Scottsdale, I heard them differently. They weren't explanations. They were cover. I also noticed my own shift. I stopped trying to be agreeable. I stopped making my schedule flexible to fit hers. I didn't ask if she needed help. I didn't offer to attend things she didn't invite me to. I wasn't punishing her. I was stepping back to see the full shape of what was happening, like you step away from a wall to see if it's bowing. And the more I stepped back, the clearer it became. This wasn't a rough patch. This was a second life forming beside mine. I didn't feel jealousy. I felt something colder, a steady, practical focus. If the truth existed, it would show itself. I didn't have to chase it. I just had to stop being the man who filled in the blanks for her. There came a point where the watching stopped feeling temporary. It wasn't dramatic. No single revelation, no screenshot, no overheard confession. It was more like a pressure equalizing inside me. One morning I woke up and realized I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hoping for clarity. I already had it. What I didn't have was the discipline to stop participating in something that was no longer mutual. So I stopped asking questions. That was the first real break. Not outwardly, nothing changed on the surface. I still asked how her day went. I still listened when she spoke. But I stopped probing, stopped filling silence, stopped offering myself as a place for her stories to land. When details didn't line up, I didn't correct them. I let them hang in the air, unsupported, until they collapsed under their own weight. I also stopped trying to be accommodating. Before, if Megan said she needed something moved, adjusted, rescheduled, I did it automatically. I treated her calendar like a priority because I thought we were pulling in the same direction. After that shift, I treated it like information, not instruction. If she had a conflict, I noted it and moved forward with my own plans. If she was late, I started without her. If she forgot something, I didn't recover it for her. There was no resentment in it. Just a quiet refusal to keep smoothing the path. Inside, something hardened, not in a bitter way, but in a final way. I understood that I wasn't going to fix this, and more importantly, that it wasn't my responsibility to try. I'd spent years solving problems that responded to effort. This wasn't one of them. Effort was just feeding it. I didn't announce the change. I didn't warn her. I didn't threaten consequences. I just redirected my energy. Toward my work. Toward clarity. Toward preparation. I reviewed our finances alone. Not because I suspected theft at first, but because I needed to know where I stood. I separated what I could without making noise. I made copies of documents I'd never needed to copy before. Operating agreements, account access, timelines. I treated my life the way I treated a property before a major renovation. Assume nothing, verify everything. Outwardly, I was calm. Maybe calmer than I'd been in years. Megan noticed that, I think. She commented once that I seemed lighter. That I wasn't as intense. I nodded. Let her believe whatever version made sense to her. But internally, I'd already changed direction. I wasn't angry. Anger requires engagement. I wasn't hurt in the way people expect. Hurt wants comfort. What I felt was resolve. A clean understanding that whatever was happening would be allowed to finish without interference from me. No fights. No ultimatums. No pleas. Just distance, discipline, and the quiet acceptance that some endings don't arrive with noise. They arrive with decisions you make alone, long before anyone else realizes the ground has shifted. That was the moment the marriage stopped being something I was inside of, and became something I was stepping away from, carefully, deliberately, without needing permission. Once I stopped engaging, the patterns didn't just appear, they clarified. Like dust settling after demolition, everything landed where it actually belonged. I didn't rush to name it. I didn't label it betrayal yet. I treated it like data, because data doesn't argue back. Transfers started catching my attention first. Small ones, not dramatic amounts. Labeled cleanly, event expense, consulting, miscellaneous. The same categories Megan had always used. What changed were the dates. Clusters. Payments landing right after the same meetings she claimed ran long. Right after the same names came up. I didn't accuse. I cross-checked. Quietly. Methodically. Then there were the phrases. Megan reused language the way people do when they're lying to themselves as much as anyone else. You know how these things go. It was nothing. You're overthinking. She'd say them lightly, almost kindly, like she was doing me a favor by minimizing it. I didn't challenge the words. I just noticed how often they appeared, and when. Tyler moved differently too. At first, he was peripheral. Then he wasn't. He showed up in places that were supposed to be neutral. Projects I was leading, spaces I'd been working in for years. He walked through them like he belonged there. Like he'd already been invited. He didn't ask questions about logistics. He commented on outcomes, on vision, on how things should feel. He never spoke to me directly about any of it. That told me more than confrontation ever could. I watched how Megan adjusted around him. Her posture, her tone, the way she deferred without realizing she was doing it. With me, she debated. With him, she aligned. That difference mattered. It showed where momentum lived. I didn't jump to conclusions. I resisted the urge to connect dots before I had enough of them. Assumptions are expensive. I'd learned that in construction and in life. You don't pour concrete until the forms are square. So I waited. I documented what I could without becoming obsessive. Dates, times, transactions. I stored it away mentally, then physically, then digitally. Not as a weapon, as a record. Because if this ever turned into something larger, and I could feel it leaning that way, I wanted facts, not feelings. The tension grew from that waiting. From knowing something was wrong and choosing not to interrupt it. People think action creates pressure. Sometimes restraint does it better. Megan sensed the shift, even if she didn't understand it. She tested boundaries, small provocations, late arrivals, dismissive comments. Each time, I responded the same way, calm, brief, uninterested. I didn't reward the behavior with emotion. And slowly, the story told itself. Not in a rush, not all at once, but clearly enough that by the time the last piece slid into place, I wasn't surprised. I was prepared. Because observation, done properly, doesn't inflame you. It steadies you. And by then, I was very steady. What I hadn't expected was how quickly something private stopped being contained. Once you remove emotion from the equation, systems respond on their own. Business does not care about intent. It cares about documentation, authority, and exposure. And our lives, Megan's and mine, were threaded through too many structures for this to stay between us. It started with quiet questions. An attorney I'd worked with years earlier flagged an inconsistency in a draft agreement Megan had routed through him. He didn't accuse. He just asked me to clarify authority. A lender paused funding on a project pending updated disclosures. An accountant asked why certain expenses were coded the way they were. None of them knew the story. They didn't need to. They were reacting to signals. I didn't rush to explain. I let professionals do what professionals do when uncertainty appears. They slow things down. They verify. They protect themselves. Documents multiplied. Emails copied more people than before. Language hardened. Where things had once moved on trust and familiarity, they now moved on paper. Megan noticed the shift immediately. She asked why everything felt formal all of a sudden. I told her we were scaling. That scrutiny comes with growth. It was true, just not in the way she assumed. Lawyers entered the picture without ceremony. Not as threats, not as leverage, but as process. Reviews, boundaries, clarifications. Each one reduced the space where improvisation lived. Each one narrowed the room for stories to change. Reputation followed finance the way shadow follows structure. People pulled back without saying why. Invitations slowed. Projects paused. The same people who once laughed easily around Megan now spoke carefully, like they were choosing words that could survive repetition. No one accused. No one confronted. They didn't have to. Uncertainty does the work quietly. What struck me most was how little I had to do. I wasn't steering outcomes. I wasn't pushing narratives. I was just not intervening. When asked direct questions, I answered plainly. When given options, I chose stability over speed. The rest unfolded on its own. The personal had become operational. And once that happens, feelings stop mattering. Only alignment does. When Megan finally tried to talk about it, she didn't come in angry. She came in light. That was her move. Humor first, pressure second, dismissal last. She sat at the kitchen island like nothing had shifted, scrolling her phone, pretending the ground wasn't already different beneath us. "You've been weird lately," she said, smiling without looking up. Distant. Did I do something, or is this one of your moods? I didn't answer right away. I finished what I was doing, closed a folder, set it aside, wiped my hands. I made sure my attention was complete before I spoke. Not for her sake. For mine. "No," I said. "You didn't do something. You did several things." That got her to look up. She laughed once, short and incredulous. "Okay, this is what I mean. You're being dramatic again." I shook my head. Slowly. Calmly. Not in disagreement, more like correction. "I'm being accurate." She leaned back, crossed her arms. The posture she used when she wanted to reassert control. "Ethan, if this is about that charity night, you need to let it go." It was a joke. Everyone jokes. "I'm not talking about the joke," I said. "I'm talking about what followed it." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Adjusted tactics. "You're imagining things," she said, softer now. "You work too much. You get in your head. Tyler is just helping with branding. You know that." "I know what he does," I said. "And I know what he doesn't." Her eyes flicked, just once. That was enough. She sighed, like I was exhausting her. So what do you want? An apology? Reassurance? Because this feels like you punishing me for nothing. I don't want anything, I said. That's the point. That unsettled her more than anger would have. She leaned forward, voice sharpening. You don't get to just check out, she said. That's not how marriages work. I met her eyes and held them. That's exactly how they end. The room went quiet. No raised voices. No slammed doors. Just the sound of the refrigerator cycling on, the hum filling the space she couldn't. She tried again, pressure this time. Reminded me of our history. Of what we'd built. Of how much people expected from us. She talked about optics. About timing. About how things would look if I kept acting this way. I listened. Then I said, I'm not acting. I've already decided. Decided what? She asked. That I'm not stepping back into roles that only work when I pretend not to see. Her face changed then. Not anger. Not fear. Recognition. The moment she realized the old levers weren't connected anymore. She stood up slowly, like she might still regain footing. You're making a mistake. I nodded once. Maybe. But it's mine. She waited for more. An argument. A demand. Something to push against. I gave her nothing. And that's when she understood there was no way back. Not because I was cruel, but because I was finished participating. After the party, I didn't initiate anything. I didn't send messages. I didn't call meetings. I didn't try to control the fallout. That was the point. Once a structure is compromised, you don't hold it together with your hands. You step back and let gravity show you what was never supported. People started making choices without consulting us. Or rather, without consulting her. Invitations stopped arriving at the house. Not dramatically, just fewer. A donor dinner postponed. A board meeting rescheduled without explanation. When Megan asked why she hadn't been looped in, the answers were polite and vague. Just streamlining. Keeping it simple. Language people use when they're quietly distancing themselves. Tyler vanished almost completely. At first, Megan said he was busy. Then she said he'd taken on a project out of state. Then she stopped mentioning him at all. His name went from constant to absent, which told me more than its presence ever had. Men like Tyler don't disappear unless the room stops rewarding them. Accounts tightened. A bank froze access pending review. Nothing accusatory, just procedural. Megan called it an inconvenience. I called it inevitable. Projects slowed. One paused entirely until signatures could be clarified. Every delay cost credibility. Every clarification removed another layer of improvisation. I stayed out of it unless my name was required. When it was, I showed up prepared. Calm. Documented. Consistent. People noticed the contrast without needing it explained. At home, Megan oscillated. Some days she was charming, like she could rewind us with warmth. Other days she was sharp, frustrated, blaming external forces. She accused me of abandoning her in public. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just said, I didn't cause this. And let the silence do the rest. What surprised her most, I think, was that I didn't enjoy any of it. There was no satisfaction in watching things stall. No relief in seeing her lose ground. Just confirmation. Confirmation that what I'd stepped away from was already hollow. Eventually, even the noise died down. Processes completed themselves. Reviews concluded. People moved on. What had once felt urgent resolved into fact. I didn't interfere. I didn't accelerate it. I let the process finish itself, the same way I let failing structures reveal where they were weakest. By the time Megan realized nothing was coming to save the version of life she'd been living, it was already gone. And there was nothing left for me to say about it. There was no moment that felt like winning. No clear end point where I could point and say, this is where it turned. Resolution didn't arrive as relief or triumph. It arrived as quiet alignment. Things simply settled into the shape they were always going to take once I stopped holding them together. The separation wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No last argument. Just paperwork, logistics, and short conversations that stayed on task. We spoke about schedules, accounts, timelines. We didn't speak about feelings. There was nothing left to negotiate there. Whatever explanations she might have offered no longer mattered. They were late, and lateness changes the value of words. I moved out without ceremony. A few boxes, files, tools, things I actually used. I left behind objects that belonged to a version of life I wasn't returning to. The house felt different even then, less like a home, more like a set that had finished filming. People asked questions in indirect ways. How are things? Still busy? I answered honestly but briefly. I'm working. I'm fine. I didn't correct assumptions. I didn't volunteer details. Silence protected my dignity better than any explanation could have. What stayed with me was the understanding that I'd been living by rules I never agreed to. Rules that said patience meant tolerance. That loyalty meant absorption. That stability required self-erasure. Walking away wasn't an act of anger. It was a correction. I didn't miss her the way I expected. I missed the idea of what I thought we were building. Once that idea dissolved, the rest followed naturally. Grief came, but it was clean. It didn't loop. It didn't beg for answers. It passed through and left clarity behind. The life I stepped into afterward wasn't exciting. It was ordered, predictable, quiet in a way that felt earned. No performance, no audience, just days that made sense when laid end to end. That was the resolution. Not closure, not revenge, just the calm knowledge that I'd removed myself from a story that required me to pretend. And I didn't look back to see who noticed. My life runs on a different rhythm now. Mornings start earlier, not because I have to rush, but because I like the quiet before the day asserts itself. Different projects, smaller teams, towns where people still shake your hand and mean it. I live in a house that fits me, not an image, and I keep it sparse on purpose. Nothing here asks me to perform. I don't chase excitement anymore. I've seen what people call thrill, and I know the invoice always arrives later, usually when no one is looking. What I value now is alignment, work that matches effort, relationships that don't require translation, silence that isn't loaded with avoidance or tension. I understand consequences better than I used to. Not as punishment, but as physics. Push here, something moves there. Ignore a crack long enough, and it becomes structural. When someone wants excitement at my expense, I don't argue, explain, or compete. I don't raise my voice or defend my boundaries. I simply close the door. And in that quiet, stable space, I finally hear myself think again.